Now we get to the second talk, a short one by Michael Riedel about automated, efficient, and accelerated knowledge modeling in the cognitive neuroimaging literature using the Athena toolkit, or what is out there. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour nous recevoir, McGill. I'm going to talk to you today about some work we've been doing generating classifiers for annotating the neuroimaging literature with labels from a cognitive ontology. Given the stuff that's kind of been discussed today and yesterday, I think that this is some pretty interesting work, and I hope you find it interesting as well. So, as no surprise to everyone, neuroimaging research has increased exponentially over the past 20 years. So with the volume comes increased complexity in the type of research being done. So embedded in this neuroimaging literature is information about structural and functional brain organization. The challenge for us as neuroscientists is to gather and harness all this information in some kind of digestible format to help improve neurocognitive models. So you've probably heard the term a few times today. The cognitive paradigm ontology is a knowledge modeling effort to study the relationship between brain structure and function. So basically what it boils down to is a set of labels or terms meant to represent the stimuli, responses, and instructions that define conditions of an fMRI experiment in a standardized format. So another key word there, standardized. So essentially what it also boils down to is a system of labels for annotating neuroimaging articles. So you can have a neuroimaging article that did a series of fMRI experiments and kind of assign these CogPo labels manually. And quickly, I'll try to explain what a few of the CogPo labels are. There are 9 what we call dimensions or types of labels, one of which is behavioral domain. And that basically would describe a mental construct. So there are 5 types of broad behavioral domains: action, cognition, emotion, interoception, and perception. And you can have subdomains within that, such as anger, fear, happiness for emotion. Then another specific type of broad label within CogPo is the paradigm class, which describes the specific type of task that was done in a paper. So this could be in-back, delay discounting, go, no go. Some other broad labels are diagnosis, instructions, context, stimulus modalities, stimulus types, response modalities, and response types. So essentially you can take all these labels and use them to manually annotate a neuroimaging article. So the problem therein is this is it takes a very long time to read an article, assess what kind of labels you want to assign to it, and really the field is just growing too fast for us to be able to keep up with this manual annotation procedure. Plus, if everybody is doing this themselves, this manual annotation is subject to bias and human error. So the goal of our work was to develop a framework for automated annotations of the neuroimaging articles. And to do that, we wanted to evaluate classifier performance by varying multiple parameters. The 3 parameters that we were going to vary is corpus, feature space, and the classification algorithm, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And then finally, once we developed our classifiers, we wanted to characterize the relationships between CogPo labels to assess similar vocabularies used for classifications. So quickly, classification features, what do I mean? Basically, a feature is a property or characteristic of something being measured, similar to an explanatory variable in a linear regression. Some examples are noise ratios and lengths of sound and speech detection, email headers and text, and spam detection, and so on. So for our analyses, we wanted to evaluate 2 different types of feature spaces, one of which is bag of words, which basically looking at the text within the article itself, grabbing out each of the words. Another feature space we wanted to assess was the cognitive atlas. So the cognitive atlas is a vocabulary of about 1,700 terms meant to describe the current state of thought of cognitive sciences. These terms can be broken down into concepts, tasks, disorders, and theories. And something that makes the cognitive atlas interesting is the relationship between terms. So, for example, you could have working memory as a kind of memory, but also a part of decision making. So as a quick example of how we would differentially look at these features, consider this text from an abstract. In the bag of words approach, the terms bipolar disorder could be broken down into bipolar, bipolar disorder, or disorder. And then bipolar mood states could be further broken down. I should also say that within bag of words, all the text that you see there could be considered as a feature. Whereas within the cognitive atlas approach, the only two terms that would be extracted from this text for classification would be bipolar disorder and mood. So those are the two types of features that we wanted to assess. And I'll quickly try to walk you through our classification procedure. So we had a data set of 2,633 manually annotated neuroimaging articles using the CogPo labels. So you can see down there at the bottom, and as I mentioned before, something else we wanted to vary was corpus. So we wanted to evaluate whether classification performance did better if you used just the article abstract or the full text itself. Again, as I mentioned, we would evaluate 2 feature spaces, and then we performed 100 iterations of a repeated cross-validation procedure where our data set was split into 5 folds. And then within each fold, that was further split into an 80% training data set and a 20% test data set. And then we did some TF-IDF transformations, which basically incorporates the term frequency and the frequency of that term across all documents. We also performed a feature reduction technique for the bag of words approach. So when we looked at the total number of terms in the bag of words, I mean, it was in the hundreds of thousands, but if you consider the full text. But the cognitive atlas only has about 1,700 terms. So we used the chi-square test to reduce the bag of words features to just the top 1,700 terms. Then there was a hyperparameter tuning cross-validation procedure, which basically just optimizes cost functions for the different classification algorithms. And the last thing that we varied was the classification algorithm itself, using the 4 algorithms you see there. So across all these variable parameters, we wanted to assess classifier performance, and to do that, we used the F1 score, which is dependent upon precision and recall, and ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 would indicate a perfect classification. For the overall performance, we averaged F1 scores across all 100 iterations for each fold and across all the CogPo labels. And this graph shows the results of all these different parameters with the classifier on the bottom. And the combination of parameters that performed the best was using the full text logistical regression algorithm and bag of words feature space. Though I'd like to point out that when using the support vector machine algorithm, the cognitive atlas feature space and bag of words feature space did not differ that greatly. Perhaps more interesting is that if you just use the text from the article abstracts themselves, the cognitive atlas feature space actually outperformed bag of words. So this is important for 2 reasons. One, authors are probably using key terms to describe their work in the article abstract, so it's probably easier to classify based on the appearance of those features, and article abstracts are just a lot more easily accessible than full text itself, which would result in a higher proportion of the literature being annotated. So we did note that the bag of words feature space performed the best. So we wanted to use the terms that were used the most for classification of behavioral domain and paradigm class labels to assess similarity. And to do that, we took the feature representations for each label and calculated a correlation, and then regressed the co-occurrence of labels from this matrix, because labels like emotion and emotion.fear will just tend to co-occur more frequently. Then we performed hierarchical clustering on the resulting matrix to assess the similarity of classification features between labels. And it's kind of hard to see, but this is the resulting dendrogram, and just based on visual inspection, we isolated 4 clusters of labels, where each cluster contains terms from both the behavioral domain and paradigm class. I'll quickly try to do a description of each one. So within the green cluster, how am I doing on time? Okay. So the green cluster is related to cognition, perception, and we took the top 10% of the features within the labels assigned to each cluster and generated just a simple word cloud. And pretty much what you see here, it's a lot of anatomical terms, but they're terms that do relate to the concept, they're anatomical locations that are expected, assuming you want to see those related to the terms. The blue cluster is related to inhibition. The purple cluster has a lot of emotion and memory labels. You can also start to see that terms related to tasks start to become involved. And then in the red cluster, there's action and pain. Within these 4 clusters, we kind of noticed that there were different topics, and so based on the association of labels. So we noticed a language topic, emotion topic, memory, and pain topics. And so we just grabbed the features from those topics and generated word clouds again. And briefly, those are kind of what you see here. I won't tell you, you can see which terms there are, but the take-home message is basically anatomical terms seem to be driving the classification of these CogPo labels. It's a little disappointing because we were hoping that this approach would kind of give insight into new ontology for describing tasks, but I guess in some sense, you kind of see anatomical regions that one would expect, like amygdala associated with emotion. So to wrap everything up, when using full text and bag of words, that classification approach worked the best. Cognitive Atlas features outperformed bag of words when only using text from the abstracts, and anatomical terms dominated features for classification. Future work, we would like to test these classifiers on an independent data set and validate them by replicating existing meta-analyses based on manual annotation. We think further specifying the relationships within Cognitive Atlas could only enhance those classifiers, and we'd also like to integrate these classifiers with existing frameworks. I'd like to thank everybody at the Neuroinformatics and Brain Connectivity Lab at Florida International University, particularly Taylor Sallow for his work on this project, and our external collaborators at Georgia State. And I'll take any questions you have at this time.
Thanks for the talk. Questions? We have time for 1 or 2.
So my main wonder is, like, have you compared the frequency of these anatomical terms with the actual frequency that they appear in the statistical maps? Or do you think it's like a interpretation bias that certain regions are getting discussed more?
I think probably, like anytime you write a discussion, you start to tend to just like use terms that you do Google search. Oh, here's this paper that relates to what I found, and they have similar.
I'm thinking like back in the day when you couldn't claim you did an emotion task unless you saw the amygdala in it.
Yeah.
Great talk. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
One more question?
So is there any chance that this ontology can be sort of can you self-learn this ontology from the corpus that you have, or is it like and how would you validate that? I mean, like I'm still a bit confused on the how do you validate the learned ontology, if you want, from the.
So it is dependent upon the ontology itself, right? And that's one of the things that we wanted to expand. We were hoping that this kind of analysis would expand in terms of like labels. You're set in that you can only annotate with a set of certain labels, which, as I mentioned, the complexity with neuroimaging research is becoming more complex, which I think is going to make this classification that much more difficult. In one sense, there's a previous meta-analysis that we're trying to replicate by, we know that what labels should be assigned to that based on CogPo. And then based on our classifiers, we want to see if we can also assign those same labels to the articles, which are broken down into specific topics related to executive function. So it's all very much a work in progress that we would like to see expanded.
So I guess at some stage, I mean, there will be a need for labeling properly with the actual articles. Meaning, okay, this is I actually found that brain region, rather than I'm just discussing that brain region in the discussion thing.
Right.
Because then you can start to really get a bit of harder facts on the. I mean, if you forget about all the problems of detection and p-hacking and all those things, like then you get what is discussed versus what is found is distinction could be an interesting separation, like instead of in the abstract, for instance, versus you would like a separate, maybe mine only the result section rather than the discussion or something. I don't know.
That is something we wanted to do was break up initially. We thought the method sections would provide more information about the task itself, whereas looking at maybe results would probably just indicate the anatomical regions, and then discussion, But just based on our initial text kind of mining approaches, we found it very difficult to separate based on sections, particularly because of the way that PDFs are exported. That's one of the things that makes it the most difficult.
Yeah, but you mean the coordinates and maps, right? Well, that's obviously where we want to go. We're hoping we're letting you know that's where we want to go, but we felt that we needed to work on classifiers and tags. But that's absolutely the next goal. We just need cooperation with other frameworks to do that, right?
All right, let's thank the speaker again.